Wisdom is a thing that is passed down intergenerationally. It is something that is acquired throughout life and then taught to others so that future generations won't have to make the same mistakes. Wisdom is perhaps what the world needs most right now. However, it always seems to be in short supply. One could argue that this is because young people lack the will or intelligence to learn from their elders, but I don't believe this to be the case. I believe the reason why our world seems to be spiraling out of control right now is because the rate of our technological change is moving faster than our culture can keep up with. You see, in ancient cultures, technology improved slowly. The world one was born into closely resembled the world they died in, and because of this, an accumulated wisdom was easier to acquire. Your grandfather could give you good advice about riding a horse because horses had been a form of transportation for 1,000 years. Your mentor can instruct you on how to train with a sword because swords have been used for countless centuries. In the modern world, however, there is no ancient wisdom that can tell us how to wisely use cell phones and computers. There is no pre-modern source which can grant us insights on the cost-benefit analysis of using a WMD during an international conflict. When I was growing up, it was common for children to teach their grandparents how to operate the new gadgets. And this marks a significant change from the way things have always been. Prior to globalism, modern science, and the developments of the Industrial Revolution, our culture had more time to adapt to the world's changing conditions. In the 21st century, we need change now more than ever, but try as we may, the society can only adjust as fast as the people who compose it. Human beings are a mixture of both nature and nurture, products of both our innate biology and our surrounding environment. For this reason, change is necessarily slow, for it takes millions of years to develop instincts and generations to develop institutions. To give an example of this apparent mismatch between the rate of personal change and the rate of technological change, consider the sudden obesity epidemic plaguing the developed world. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were always on the brink of starvation. It took only one bad winter, or one poor harvest, or one unexpected storm to completely wipe out the food supply. Whether it was back-breaking work in the fields or physically hunting one's prey, our ancestors had to engage in extreme exertion just to eat. Because of this, the body developed certain cravings. It sought sweet and savory foods, which were likely to contain essential nutrients, and it sought rest and comfort so that one did not have to expend more energy than necessary. For 99% of human history, these instincts were essential to our survival. In the present, however, they come with unintentional side effects. In the last few decades, and really it's only been a few decades, a plethora of cheap sugary goods have been made available to an increasingly inactive public. Not only are we surrounded by vast grocery stores, restaurants, and fast food chains, there are now thousands of professions that do not require any type of physical labor at all. When one combines this with our biological instincts to consume and rest, it makes sense why an epidemic like obesity would occur. It's a negative side effect of an otherwise positive world development. We should celebrate the fact that we now have the technology to stock the shelves with food. What we should recognize, however, is that our instincts have not caught up with this change in conditions, nor has our culture taught us how to navigate the inherent side effects. Can we blame people for acting on their own biological imperatives? No. But we can put in place systems which incentivize health and education. In some ways, we've already begun to. That's what gyms are. That's what sports are. That's what dietary books and weight loss programs seek to do. None of them try to undo technological progress. Instead, they try to develop ways for us to thrive in a new environment. When it comes to most other pressing issues facing our world, the solution will have to be similar. Take climate change, for instance. Climate change, just like obesity, is the negative side effect of an otherwise positive development. That development is life. For most of human history, the rate of early childhood death was quite high. Not only did this limit the human population, it deeply traumatized those who survived. In addition, the sick were regularly left untreated, violence was many orders of magnitude higher than today, those with disabilities were often neglected, and dangerous storms were less easily predicted. Prior to the year 1800, there were less than 1 billion people in the world. Then, in the last century, our planet's population skyrocketed from 1.2 billion to its current 7.7 billion. This was all due in part to the rapid shift in technology which occurred after the Industrial Revolution. Improved farming practices led to more food on more tables. Heating and air conditioning allowed one to better withstand hot summers and cold winters. Refrigeration, running water, and other forms of sanitation led to a substantial increase in hygiene. All of these developments raised the human standard of living tremendously. Yet because they depended on high resource consumption and a primitive form of energy production, the environment suffered as a consequence. Are we to blame people for their consumption when it has meant the life and livelihood of their families? Of course not. What we must do is invent more ethical systems of production which reconcile our need to improve human living standards with the need to preserve nature's integrity. Had human population growth been as slow as it was in centuries past, the climate crisis would not be as urgent. It is only because our civilization is growing so fast and with so little time for course adjustment that we find ourselves destroying the biosphere. When it comes to matters of life and death, we find ourselves in a predicament no different. At the moment, the world's richest nations are stockpiling an arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. Between the assortment of toxic gases, weaponized viruses, conventional explosives, and nuclear bombs, we have enough weapons to kill everyone on the planet many times over. It may seem absurd that a planet in crisis would rig itself to explode, but we must recall that within living memory, the entire world was engulfed in war. Our planet suffers from a collective PTSD, where the memory of slavery, war, genocide, and colonialism is still fresh in the minds of leadership. Can we blame vulnerable nations for seeking advanced weaponry when it's been the only thing protecting against their predatory neighbors? Considering that our modern military strategies were created by men and women who lived through 2 world wars, multiple holocausts, and an age of colonialism, it is not surprising that they would take such an aggressive stance against their enemies. What we must do is find ways of disarmament which don't increase the likelihood of an all-out war between the world powers. While some would argue that human beings by their very nature are wicked, I do not. I believe that although we're predisposed to certain behavioral tendencies as a result of our biology, the vast majority of what makes us unique comes from life experience. This is why I don't look with judgmental eyes towards the world. One need only read a brief amount of history to understand that the existence of civilization itself is a miracle. Just as child abuse, poverty, indoctrination, drug addiction, and the loss of loved ones can create trauma which takes decades to overcome, human societies have intergenerational trauma, which we've only just begun to address. When one asks how our species could be so superstitious, racist, violent, and wasteful, one should remember that our ancestors lived very different lives. Consider that for tens of thousands of years, cultures across the globe have taught their children creationist myths. Only in the last 160 have we known about evolution. Is it surprising, then, that not everyone in the modern world believes in evolution? It takes time to relinquish a deeply held belief, and when you have millions of people with a shared culture reinforcing each other's biases, it can take generations before the truth is finally accepted. On matters of racial and ethnic tension, we find ourselves similarly struggling. For countless years, cultures have been telling themselves that their identity group is special. Sometimes this is because they think their biology is superior. Other times it's because they believe God or some other supernatural force has chosen them. Whatever the reason, ideologies of supremacy are deeply embedded in our cultures. On top of this, in-group preference, territoriality, and tribalism, frankly, are instincts we're innately predisposed to feel. It is only recently, within 1 or perhaps 2 human lifetimes, that we discovered a common hominid lineage in the fossil beds of Africa. Are we to expect that the whole world accepts our shared humanity overnight? I think not. Yet racial equality, much like evolutionary biology, is increasingly being understood by the general public. These issues have the power to improve, just as they have for the last century. Thomas Jefferson once said that an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. But what happens when the knowledge required to wisely run a society increases by the year? It takes decades to become an expert in just one field of biology. Imagine how many decades it would take to become an expert not just in all biological fields, but every branch of science, history, civics, and philosophy. It would take more time than any one person has. And as the number of fields to specialize in increases, it becomes more difficult for our society to become informed on the important issues. Most human beings don't have the luxury of getting to read all day. They have to work, raise children, navigate personal issues, and try to enjoy themselves all the while. Should we then expect them to understand the intricacies of climate change, global trade, or international military alliances? Perhaps not. But if we can't expect them to be sufficiently educated, how can we expect them to make sufficiently educated decisions at the ballot box? Is democracy itself doomed? Advanced tools should not be wielded by ignorant minds, and depending on the subject, we are all quite ignorant. In this way, we find ourselves in the midst of a profound dilemma. Our instincts developed to match the conditions of an ancient jungle. Our civic institutions were designed to address the political concerns of a pre-industrial society. And yet at the same time, we are supposed to manage world-changing technology responsibly. It can't be done, at least not without mistakes. Consider that before 1903, no one had ever flown an airplane in the sky. Yet by 1969, only 66 years later, there were humans walking on the moon. Consider that in World War I, men still rode horses into battle. Yet in World War II, only 27 years later, fighter planes destroyed cities with atomic bombs. The rate of change taking place in the world is astronomical, and it shows no signs of slowing down. If we do not make major changes to the way we conduct political, economic, scientific, and military affairs, we may very well lose our planet. The question facing us now is, how do we change in order to adapt to this new world while still preserving what was good about the old? I believe there is a way to navigate these issues, to manage our fragile civilization by making structural changes to aspects of modern life. Some may call this revolutionary thinking, but there's a reason I don't. When you look at the revolutions that have taken place across the last 3 centuries, you find that many of them are characterized by considerable force and bloodshed. The French Revolution was a movement based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, yet it collapsed into a reign of terror in which charismatic leaders sent thousands of political dissidents to the guillotine. The Russian Revolution was a movement based on the emancipation of all working people, yet it collapsed into a great purge where mass executions and famine were common. In both the capitalist and socialist traditions, revolution has often resulted in tyranny. This is because when you forcibly and abruptly end a system, when you overthrow an existing power structure without immediately replacing it, you create a power vacuum which destabilizes society. In the chaos of this vacuum, those most willing to use violence typically come out on top, and it is from this conflict that grotesque figures gain dictatorial power. There is, however, an example of a revolution where this did not take place. A revolution where I would argue democracy succeeded, as imperfect as it was. This was the American Revolution. The United States succeeded in achieving its goals because in many ways it wasn't a true revolution. It was a separatist movement. Prior to declaring independence, the 13 colonies had a variety of functioning British institutions. They had a court system, a legislature, and a number of legally protected rights. When the colonies defeated the British, they did not abolish these institutions. Instead, they modified them in ways which made the system beholden to a federal government rather than a foreign monarch. While it certainly would have been tempting to eradicate these institutions and construct something entirely new, Americans are unbelievably fortunate it didn't happen. The burn it down and start from scratch approach no doubt appeals to the human fantasy, but it doesn't work. So when we as concerned citizens talk about important changes to the world, we should be talking about them in this context, not as a subversive and destructive movement, but as a bold yet reformist approach. We must do something about the proliferation of WMDs, the destruction of the environment, the erosion of civil liberties, and the rise of extreme inequality. We must also make sure that our principles of democracy, secularism, individual rights, and voluntary exchange survive these changes. Reformism is slow, and in a world changing radically fast, it's easy to fall into an authoritarian mindset, but we must resist the temptation. Wisdom must win out. So with this in mind, have some faith in your fellow human beings. Consider all that we've been through historically and what a miracle it is that we've made it this far. The planet is facing some daunting challenges, and humanity is to blame for them, but that doesn't make our species evil. It doesn't make us insane. We are shaped by the conditions of our times, and those conditions are shifting quicker than we can currently keep track of. we have to forgive ourselves for what we've done and regain hope that we can actually solve future problems. Think of it this way. If you were a casual observer reading the news in 1939, you'd think the world was ending. A Great Depression was crashing the economy, communism and fascism were on the rise, colonial empires still dominated the globe, and the planet was moving towards a Second World War. How could our species ever come back from something like this? How could ethnic hatred so intense ever be resolved? And yet, somehow, our species did. Hitler was defeated. Communism collapsed. Former colonies across the developing world gained independence. This wasn't without its costs. Millions died in the struggle, but a better world came about. I'm not going to deny that some aspects of modern life are going to get worse in the next few decades. The polluters are going to keep polluting. The Ukraine conflict won't be the last international proxy war, and governments and corporations will keep trying to put civilians under surveillance. Yet in spite of all of this, there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic. Technology ultimately is just a tool, and it can be used for good or evil depending on the way it's wielded. To give you an example, consider nuclear fission. This is the process by which human scientists are able to split individual atoms. Nuclear fission technology can be used to produce green, carbonless energy. It can also be used to produce weapons which eradicate entire cities. The irony of the situation couldn't be more real. Humanity possesses a technology which, depending on how we use it, could either destroy our world or save it. It has the productive capacity to safeguard our health and loved ones, or annihilate everything we cherish. Even the device you're using to watch this has the same implications. Our information technology allows us to summon knowledge at the press of a button. You can watch free Harvard lectures or cat videos, well-sourced journalism or unfounded conspiracism. The internet can be an educational tool or an outlet for mass delusion, once again, depending on how we use it. Which brings us back to the topic of wisdom. How do we wield technology wisely? Some people think that because of human nature, we are doomed to repeat the cruel behaviors which have characterized every previous era. And to some extent this is true, but remember that through accumulated intergenerational wisdom, we've been able to do the impossible. Slavery, which existed for 10,000 years, was suddenly outlawed across the West in the 19th century. Smallpox, which killed millions per year for basically all of recorded history, was eradicated in the 20th century. People used to look up at the night sky and believe there were gods living up there. Now we look up at the night sky and know there are human beings living up there. All of these achievements were thought impossible at one point in time. Are the tasks we're faced with now any more impossible? Absolutely not. They too can be resolved through human wit and human will. Part of the reason I make videos like this is because I want people to see the bright side of life, to feel hopeful, to not just focus on the negativity which modern media emphasizes on a daily basis. Our species isn't evil. It's not insane. It's just human. And as the acceleration of our civilization constantly speeds up, we have to find new ways of navigating these issues wisely. I have a few ideas of how to do this, but ultimately that's for another video, or, more realistically, several. So anyways, thank you for listening, and if you'd like more material a little on the optimistic side, please subscribe to the channel. It would help a lot. And with that, see you later.